It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. Today we are showing you the first excerpts of the film The Israel Lobby Does Not Want You to See. The news channel Al Jazeera sent undercover journalists into pro-Israeli government groups in the United States. Among several things, they uncovered closely coordinated efforts by these groups and the Israeli government to monitor, smear, and intimidate U.S.-based defenders of Palestinian rights. The film is called The Lobby, USA, but it has never been released. That's because the Israeli government and the Israel lobby pressured Qatar to censor it. Qatar, which owns Al Jazeera, caved to that campaign, citing national security. But that censorship has not buried the film for good. The website Electronic Intifada has obtained the first excerpts of the film. But before we go to that excerpt, we're going to speak first to the journalist who obtained it. Asa Winstanley is the independent journalist and the Electronic Intifada's associate editor. Welcome, Asa. First of all, congratulations on this scoop. This is the second major scoop that Electronic Intifada has had about this censored film. You first revealed its contents. Now you're actually showing us an excerpt. So set up the scene for us with this excerpt that you've obtained. It concerns a wealthy pro-Israel donor named Adam Milstein and his funding of the group, the Canary Mission. Explain who he is and the group that he funds.
Well, Adam Milstein, as you said, he's an Israeli-American financier who, he's said to be worth some $500 million, and he funds various pro-Israel groups in the US, including the Israel on Campus Coalition, Stand With Us, AIPAC, and many others. And in this clip, Eric Gallagher, who was at that time the development director for another of the group that Milstein funds called the Israel Project, is speaking to Al Jazeera's undercover reporter who was interning at that time with the Israel Project, and he's basically trying to get in good with him, and he's telling the reporter that, well, you'll see in the clip.
Okay, so let's go to the clip. So we have first, in this excerpt, we have Tony, as Asa was just describing. Tony is the undercover Al Jazeera journalist. He's speaking to Eric Gallagher, and Eric Gallagher is explaining to him who the funder is of the Canary Mission. And then later on, we go and we see that funder, Adam Milstein, talking about his work and why he is funding websites like Canary Mission. This is the excerpt.
In this country, you have these billionaire types who are starting to realize, like, oh, wow, I don't need to participate in the Republican or Democratic parties. I could build my own apparatus and have influence from Los Angeles or Detroit. And Adam Milstein's one of those guys.
Milstein told Tony how critics of Israel should be handled.
First of all, investigate who they are. What's their agenda? They're picking on the Jews because it's easy, because it's popular. We need to expose what they really are. And we need to expose the fact that they're anti-everything we believe in. They're anti-freedom, they're anti-Christian, they're anti-democracy. That's what we need to do.
So that is a clip from the censored Al Jazeera documentary called The Lobby, USA. And we just heard there an undercover journalist speaking to Adam Milstein, the funder of Canary Mission, and before that to Eric Gallagher, who was working for a pro-Israel lobby group, and revealed Milstein to be the funder of the Canary Mission. So explain what the Canary Mission is and the significance of this revelation that Milstein is its funder.
Yeah, the Canary Mission is an anonymous website that's been going since 2015, and it has on it profiles of Palestine solidarity activists, mostly young students, often of Palestinian heritage or Muslim heritage, background, and it smears them as anti-Semites, as racist, and it has the explicit goal of denying them future career prospects. On each profile, it has at the top, "If you're racist, the world should know," some of the operatives behind the website state as their goal to keep this secret who who is running this website, their main goal is to keep the people behind it a secret. And in that clip, Eric Gallagher has stated that it's Adam Milstein who's actually originated it.
And they have kept that secret up until this point. So let's go to another clip, not from the documentary, but from the Canary mission itself, where it talks about its mission, what it does in the U.S.
College campuses are filled with anti-Semitic and anti-American radicals, waving Palestinian flags and placards and screaming apartheid and murderer. A few years later, these individuals are applying for jobs within your company. There's no record of their membership of radical organizations. No one remembers their yelling profanities on campus or attending Jew-hating conferences and anti-American rallies. All evidence has been eradicated, and soon they will be part of your team. We are Canary Mission, an organization dedicated to documenting these acts of hate, exposing them, and holding these individuals accountable. Join us to combat this wave of hatred, protect freedom, and make campus life safe for everyone. It is your duty to ensure that today's radicals are not tomorrow's employees.
A clip from a publicity video from the Canary mission. So in terms of the impact of this group, this has meant, right, that job applicants have been questioned about their Palestinian solidarity work. And from what I understand of what the film contains, and also just from what the Electronic Intifada has been reporting, it's also meant that when students or anyone really, especially those of Palestinian origin living in the US, come to Israel, that information supplied by the Canary mission has been used in some interrogations. Is that true?
Yeah, that's correct. We've reported for years now that Palestinian American students who go to visit family and friends in Palestine, in the occupied West Bank and elsewhere in Palestine, that they are denied entry after having been profiled on Canary mission, despite not necessarily being, somebody like myself, like a journalist who, has a public profile. They may just be students with some, they've joined the local Students for Justice in Palestine, for example, and they'll be profiled in Canary mission, and then soon after report being denied entry. And even more recently, this month, the Forward reported that Andrew Cady, who is a Palestinian American who works for the who works for the U.S. campaign against the occupation, a Palestine solidarity organization in the U.S., that he actually saw the people, the Israeli border officials use the Canary mission profile as the basis for their questioning him upon entry.
Okay, so aside from free speech and privacy rights, this raises another issue, which is the extent of the coordination between the Israeli government and these lobby groups in the U.S., and whether or not that raises issues of violations of laws around foreign agent registration, because these groups are not registered as foreign agents. What can you tell us, based on the film's revelations, about the extent of cooperation between these U.S.-based lobby groups and the Israeli government?
Yeah, it's a good question. These groups work very closely with the Israeli government, and what we've written in this article, it's not in one of the clips that we've released, but we know from our sources that Jacob Bain and Ian Hirsch of the Israel on Campus Coalition, who seem to be the people who actually run the Canary mission on behalf of not Sheldon Adelson, on behalf of Adam Milstein, the funder of the Canary mission website, according to Eric Gallagher. They, in the film, in excerpts that haven't been released yet, they state that they are working they communicate with and they coordinate with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is essentially, in my analysis and in my reporting, I've called it essentially a covert sabotage campaign, covert sabotage operation. It's almost like a new Israeli intelligence agency. Its focus is on working against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, and other forms of solidarity with Palestine around the world. And it does it in coordination with groups in many different countries. And in this censored Al Jazeera film, Jacob Bain's deputy at the ICC in Hirsch says that they work closely with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and they actually coordinate with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So as you say, it does raise questions of perhaps these groups should really be, are they in violation of US law by not registering as foreign agents?
The question raised by the film. Finally, I said, I want to make a point, which is that there's been some debate for a while about the extent of the influence of the Israel lobby, and people have strong opinions on this issue. My personal opinion is that it's in some respects overblown when people say that the Israel lobby shapes White House policies. It shapes, national US policies. I've always felt as if that goes too far because, for example, when the Israel lobby and the White House clash, like on the Iran nuclear deal, the Israel lobby is usually brushed aside. But on matters such as this, when it points to, pressuring people into trying to intimidate activists, intimidate voices, brave defenders of Palestinian rights, and wielding a large amount of money toward that end, I think that this film and the revelations that you've been uncovering at the Electronic Intifada provide a stark illustration. And of course, in terms of impacting congressional races, because the Israel lobby can raise a lot of money there. But I just think that the fact that this film has exposed these secret maneuverings to combat activism speaks to where the Israel lobby is most influential and insidious in the US. Let me ask you finally, you have broken a lot of news so far on this film, its contents, and on the first excerpt. Are there more excerpts coming?
Well, we've stated what we've stated in the article, and that's all we're going to be saying on that for now. And I think that the question that what we've always been calling for, in terms of if there's anything we're calling for, is that Al Jazeera should release the film. We want Al Jazeera to broadcast the film because, the film, what we know of it so far, is an important piece of work. And we know that when they did the lobby, the UK edition last year, there were complaints put in about it with the UK's broadcasting regulator by some of the subjects of the film, accusing it of anti-Semitism and accusing it of being unfair and selectively edited and all those kinds of things. The broadcasting regulator looked into it. They looked, they put the film through the ringer. They looked at unedited footage to verify it and all these kinds of things. It was vindicated on all counts. So really, these kind of pressure behind the scenes, legal, sort of implications that there might be some sort of legal threats and whatnot, are delaying tactics to try and stop the truth getting out. So question needs to really be asked to Al Jazeera: why are you not broadcasting this film? And I think we should see it broadcast today.
It's interesting what you say there about the vetting process in the UK, because as I understand it, the film also went through a vetting process here in the US, where people like Adam Milstein were given an opportunity to reply to the film's revelations. But as I understand it, Milstein and others declined that opportunity, right?
Yeah, that's right. Clayton Swisher said months ago, he wrote an article for The Ford about his frustration that the film had been put on ice.
And Clayton Swisher is with Al Jazeera, just to explain who he is. Yeah. That's
right. Sorry. Yes. Clayton Swisher, the head of the investigations unit at Al Jazeera, whose project the unit that ran this project, he's talking about his frustration that has been put on ice, and he's saying that, look, months ago we sent letters out, sent about 70 letters out to all the subjects of the film. Hardly any of them replied. A very small handful of people replied. And Milstein did not reply to these multiple requests for comment. So he doesn't have the excuse of like, oh, I didn't see the email. He's effectively chosen not to reply until yesterday, when we published our article and we released these excerpts of the film. So the fact that he's been outed now, only now he's denying it. I mean, and that tells you a lot.
Well, Asa, in the absence of Al Jazeera releasing the full film, which appears unlikely given that they've already caved to the very heavy pressure campaign that they faced, we will hope for more excerpts from the Electronic Intifada. And if you want to see the first excerpt that they have released, you can go to electronicintifada.net. Asa Winstanley, Associate Editor at the Electronic Intifada, thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.